They never heard it coming. Not the sound of engines. Not the whistle of bombs. Not even the distant hum of aircraft cutting through the Pacific sky. Because long before any Japanese pilot appeared on the horizon, America already knew. While the world believed wars were won with steel, fire, and bravery, the United States was quietly building a weapon no one could see, a weapon that could detect death before it arrived. An invisible shield stretching from Hawaii to Alaska, from lonely Pacific outposts to California's silent cliffs. A network of towers, antennas, and glowing screens watched the skies day and night, manned by young soldiers who held the fate of entire cities in their hands. Most people have heard about Pearl Harbor. But almost no one knows what came after. When America built the one thing Japan could never outfly. Eyes that could see through the darkness of war. Before World War II, the Pacific Ocean was a vast, empty silence, 12 million square miles of open water where danger could rise from the horizon without warning. For the United States, this silence was terrifying. Japan's air arm seemed unstoppable, its pilots trained for lightning-fast surprise attacks. And America, spread thin across islands and coastlines, had no way to see them coming. But everything changed after December 7, 1941. Shaken by the devastation of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military realized that battleships and fighter squadrons alone couldn't protect the homeland. What America needed wasn't more firepower, it was foresight. A way to detect an enemy long before he reached American airspace. A way to turn those silent skies into something readable, predictable. And so began one of the most ambitious scientific missions in history, the creation of a coast-to-coast radar defense network. Built by physicists, engineers, and teenage soldiers who had never even seen a radar screen before. This wasn't a system of machines. It was a system of guardians, quiet, disciplined, and nearly forgotten by history. But their invisible weapon would soon reshape the entire war. Because this time, when Japan came back, America was ready. Before radar, the Pacific War was a game played in darkness. America, despite its industrial might, stood nearly blind across thousands of lonely miles. The ocean that once offered protection had become a battlefield without borders, where danger could rise from any wave, any cloud, any minute of the night. In early 1941, U.S. commanders feared one thing above all: surprise. Japan's naval air forces were masters of it. Their pilots trained for years in aggressive long-range strikes, flying low across the sea, hidden by the curvature of the earth. American scouts could search for hours and find nothing, until it was already too late. The United States had listening posts, patrol aircraft, and coastal observers, but these were human eyes trying to monitor a sky larger than continents. A pilot could be scanning the horizon one moment and miss an entire formation sweeping in from beyond visibility. The Pacific was simply too vast, too unpredictable. On islands like Oahu, Midway, and the Aleutians, soldiers lived with a constant sense of unease. They knew Japanese reconnaissance planes were out there, quietly testing defenses, mapping weak spots, trying to understand exactly how long America took to react. Every shadow at dusk, every far-off engine noise, every unusual radio crackle made nerves tighten. The Pacific was alive with the possibility of attack. And yet, for all their vigilance, American forces lacked the one thing that could change everything: time. Time to scramble fighters. Time to alert battleships. Time to evacuate civilians. Time to fire the first shot, rather than receive it. Pearl Harbor proved just how catastrophic that missing time could be. Japan's 6 carriers crossed the Pacific unseen, hidden by storms and silence. American air patrols didn't spot them. The Navy didn't sense them. The Army didn't expect them. When the bombs began to fall, the United States had just minutes, mere minutes, to understand what was happening. The attack didn't just shatter ships. It shattered confidence. If America remained blind, it would always be vulnerable. If it could not see the enemy coming, it would always be reacting, never preventing. Across the military, from Washington strategists to junior officers stationed on remote outposts, one idea began to take shape, an idea that bordered on science fiction for its time. What if the sky could be watched, even when no one was looking? What if technology could do what human eyes could not? What if an invisible wave, traveling faster than any aircraft, could sense danger before danger arrived? In the quiet hours after Pearl Harbor, that question grew into desperation. Desperation became planning. Planning became innovation. And innovation would give birth to a weapon unlike anything seen before, a weapon not made of steel, fuel, or gunpowder, but of energy. A weapon that could stretch across oceans, warn cities, guide pilots, and finally give America what it never had before. A way to see the enemy coming long before the first bomb fell. In the days after Pearl Harbor, America wasn't just mourning. It was building. Across universities, laboratories, military bases, and coastal command posts, one mission suddenly united scientists and soldiers. Create a weapon that could buy time. A weapon that could reach across the Pacific long before Japanese aircraft appeared overhead. Radar wasn't new, Britain had used an early version during the Battle of Britain. But the United States needed something far more advanced, far more powerful, and far more widespread. It needed a radar web so large, so sensitive, and so fast that no enemy squadron could slip through unnoticed. And so, in a quiet corner of Cambridge, Massachusetts, inside the campus of MIT, something extraordinary began. A group of young physicists, some barely older than college kids, were pulled out of classrooms and placed into a new command. The MIT Radiation Laboratory, simply called the RAD Lab. It would become one of the most secretive and influential scientific centers of the entire war. These were not soldiers. They didn't wear uniforms. But they carried the fate of America on their drafting tables. They worked with chalkboards, vacuum tubes, copper wiring, and mountains of handwritten calculations. They argued over frequencies, pulse lengths, wave reflections, antenna shapes. They failed, rebuilt, failed again, and refused to stop. Every hour mattered. Every delay meant more American lives at risk. The Japanese threat wasn't waiting. Long-range aircraft like the Mitsubishi G4M, Betty, could strike American bases deep across the Pacific. Carrier groups could appear from behind storm fronts. Submarines could launch reconnaissance planes from foldable hangars hidden inside their hulls. Time was the enemy. And radar was the only weapon that could defeat it. Inside the RAD Lab, scientists worked day and night under locked doors and coded identifications. Military officers monitored progress. Couriers rushed classified notes to Washington. Engineers from General Electric, Bell Labs, and RCA arrived to turn fragile designs into hardened machines capable of surviving salt air, monsoon winds, and battlefield chaos. But building radar wasn't enough. America needed to teach thousands of young soldiers how to use it. So the military rounded up recruits, farm boys, factory workers, mechanics, radio hobbyists, men who had never heard the word wavelength in their life, and transformed them into radar operators. They learned to read tiny blips on glowing green screens. They learned to distinguish birds, storms, friendly aircraft, and Japanese formations. They learned to trust the machine more than their own eyes. Every operator knew the truth. A single mistake could cost a city its warning. A single ignored signal could let an entire bombing raid slip through. And while the scientists worked on the next upgrade, the next breakthrough, the operators trained for the moment everyone feared. When Japan would strike again. The clock was ticking. The Pacific was watching. And America's invisible weapon was almost ready. But before it could protect anyone, it first had to be built across half the world. By early 1942, blueprints had become machines, and machines were ready to become a shield. But building a radar system was nothing like building a fortress. A fortress stands tall, visible, intimidating. Radar had to do the opposite. It had to be everywhere. And yet remain unseen. So America began constructing one of the largest early warning networks the world had ever imagined, stretching thousands of miles across ocean, jungle, mountains, and frozen tundra. The first pieces were placed in Hawaii, still scarred from the flames of Pearl Harbor. Towers rose along Oahu's cliffs, their rotating antennas scanning every inch of sky. Soldiers worked under strict secrecy, hauling heavy equipment up narrow dirt roads where each step felt like another vow: never again will this island be caught blind. From Hawaii, the chain expanded outward. To tiny atolls in the mid-Pacific, places where no one lived, where winds howled through abandoned coconut groves, but where radar operators now sat in small wooden shacks illuminated only by the eerie glow of their scopes. Then came the Aleutian Islands, a frozen frontier stretching toward Japan's northern approaches. There, the U.S. military built stations on barren cliffs where fog swallowed mountains whole. Operators had to battle not just cold, but isolation. For weeks, they heard nothing but the wind screaming across metal towers. And yet, they stayed alert, because the Japanese could exploit any weakness, any gap in coverage. Some sites were staffed by barely 20 men. Others were so remote that supplies arrived only every few weeks via dangerous sea routes. Letters from home took months to arrive. But loneliness wasn't the enemy, silence was. Every operator lived with one fear. The next blip might not be training. It might be real. And the chain didn't stop there. Along the Pacific coast, from Washington down through Oregon and into California, radar stations appeared like sentinels guarding the continent. Some were hidden inside camouflaged bunkers. Others disguised their antennas as barns or lighthouses to keep Japanese submarines from recognizing them. In California, radar screens watched both sky and sea. Japanese submarines had already shelled the coastline once. Another attack wasn't just possible, it was expected. At any moment, operators might need to pick up a low-flying bomber slipping in from offshore or a reconnaissance plane launched from a submarine deck. The entire system had to function as one organism. A blip detected in Alaska. Passed to Seattle. Relayed to San Francisco. Scrambled fighters from inland bases. And alerted naval commands from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. All in minutes. Because those minutes were the difference between a warning and a disaster. For the first time in history, America could see beyond the horizon. The ocean was no longer silent. The sky was no longer empty. And yet, for all its power, this network had not been tested. Japan was watching. Japan was planning. And soon, the invisible shield would face its first real challenge. The true test came not with fanfare, but with a quiet pulse of light on a radar screen. It was just after 4 a.m. Cold winds swept across a lonely outpost in the Aleutian chain. Inside a small radar shack, a young operator named Private Harold Dean stared at his glowing scope. The night had been silent, too silent. The kind of silence that made operators uneasy. The kind that often came before something broke loose across the Pacific sky. And then he saw it. A faint echo. Then another. Then, a formation. At first, Harold thought it was sea clutter, waves bouncing radar signals back. But the blips were rising, holding tight formation, moving fast. Too fast for weather. Too organized for birds. And they were coming straight toward American territory. He leaned closer, tracing the pattern with shaking fingers. Multiple contacts, bearing southeast, altitude increasing. Those weren't waves. They were aircraft. A lot of them. Within seconds, alarms raced across the network. Radar stations relayed the signal from one post to the next, operators shouting coordinates into telephones, Morse keys clattering, officers jolting awake in dark command rooms. The early warning chain had come alive. In Alaska, fighter squadrons scrambled from their runways. Pilots sprinted from barracks, engines roared to life, propellers chopped through cold air as Mustang and Airacobra fighters clawed into the dawn sky. Anti-aircraft crews dashed to their guns, loading belts, adjusting angles, watching the horizon with narrowed eyes. But this time, they weren't surprised. Radar had bought them something precious. Time. As fighters climbed, Japanese aircraft broke through the clouds. They were bombers from the Kuril Islands, sent to harass American positions in the Aleutians, testing the northern flank, searching for weakness. They expected to catch the Americans unaware. They were wrong. Waiting for them were fighters positioned exactly where radar had predicted they would appear. In the chaos that followed, Japanese formations were ambushed. Bombers scattered. Several were shot down. Others turned back before even reaching their targets. It wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a psychological one. Across the Pacific, similar moments unfolded again and again. In the Solomon Islands, radar spotted Japanese night raids long before their engines could be heard. American fighters rose to meet them, breaking formations that once terrorized bases. In Hawaii, radar picked up reconnaissance planes before they could gather intelligence, forcing them to flee. Along the California coast, radar identified a submarine-launched aircraft attempting to scout for targets, allowing defenses to activate before the pilot reached shore. Japan's greatest strength, its ability to strike suddenly, was fading. Pilots who once relied on surprise now found themselves facing ready defenses, prepared gunners, and fighters already circling at altitude. They began calling the radar network the unseen enemy. Because every time they tried to slip in unnoticed, something in the dark was already watching them. And the invisible weapon was only getting stronger. By 1944, the Pacific War had transformed. Not because America had more ships. Not because it had more aircraft. But because it had something Japan didn't fully understand. A shield of pure information. Radar turned the Pacific from a guessing game into a map of moving dots, shadows, and signals. Every Japanese squadron, every bomber wing, every reconnaissance flight now risked detection the moment it left its base. And detection meant preparation. Preparation meant survival. Survival meant victory. What once required luck now relied on science. Radar-guided intercepts became routine. American fighters could launch before Japanese aircraft even reached cruising altitude. Naval convoys could change course hours before an enemy submarine reached firing position. Anti-aircraft gunners no longer waited helplessly in silence, they tracked altitude, speed, and bearing long before targets entered range. Even the largest battles of the Pacific began to shift. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, radar picked up incoming Japanese waves at extreme distances. American commanders used the radar data to place fighters perfectly in their path, shooting down hundreds of enemy planes before they came close enough to strike the fleet. Without radar, that battle could have ended very differently. But radar's true power wasn't in the metal towers or glowing screens. It lay in the people who watched them. Hundreds of young operators, often working in cramped rooms that smelled of hot electronics, sat for hours in total silence. Their world was a circle of green light, a rotating sweep, and faint marks that could signal life or death. They learned to read the rhythm of the skies, identifying storms, birds, and friendly aircraft until the moment something unfamiliar appeared. Most never fired a shot. Most never saw the planes they detected. But every blip they called out saved lives. Some operators tracked incoming raids through exhaustion and fear, knowing that a single mistake could allow a bomber group to slip past. Others guided lost American pilots home through storms, talking them down with calm voices as if the operator himself were flying beside them. These were the silent guardians of the Pacific War. Forgotten in textbooks, overshadowed by battleships and fighter aces, yet essential to every victory. Even Japanese pilots eventually felt the weight of this invisible enemy. They complained their attacks no longer achieved surprise. They noticed American fighters rising earlier than physics should allow. They began to suspect an unseen watcher was always present, always awake. And they were right. Because by 1945, the U.S. Pacific radar network had become something extraordinary. A living, breathing system that saw further, reacted faster, and anticipated danger in ways no enemy could counter. It didn't win battles alone. But without it, many battles would have been lost. Radar didn't roar like engines. It didn't explode like bombs. It didn't advance like infantry. But it changed everything. It was the invisible weapon. Quiet, patient, relentless. That helped America seize control of the Pacific sky. When the war finally ended, pilots were celebrated, ships were photographed, and generals wrote their memoirs. But the men who guarded America's invisible shield packed their uniforms and went home without fanfare. Most never spoke of what they did. Most were never asked. Yet their work lived in every victory, every mission saved, every attack stopped before it began. Radar didn't just defend coastlines, it restored confidence to a nation that had once been blindsided. It gave soldiers time, commanders knowledge, and civilians safety. It neutralized Japan's greatest advantage and reshaped the very nature of Pacific warfare. Standing in those dimly lit rooms, watching glowing screens through sleepless nights, these unsung operators changed the course of history without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Their weapon left no crater, no smoke, no echo. But it left a mark on the war that can never be erased. Because sometimes, the strongest weapon is the one no enemy ever sees.